What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? How are you doing tonight? And welcome to another episode of Faith Unaltered. I am your host, Tyler Fowler, and as you can see, we have a panel of guests with us tonight to talk determinism, compatibilism, Calvinism, and everything that goes into that mix. But first, before we get into that, Joshua Davidson is here with me, Dale Glover, Colton Carlson, and Tyler Vela. So, guys, how are y'all doing tonight? Josh, we'll start with you. What is up, brother? I know you had a very busy day today interacting with a block party that was going down over in your neck of the woods. So tell us about that, bro, and how you're doing.
I'm doing all right. I'm tired and a bit sore, but I'm ready to go. I feel pretty good, and I feel like this is going to be a good episode. It's going to be a lot to talk about. But yeah, my day was pretty crazy. I was on my feet from about 6 this morning until literally 10 minutes ago. And my body is very thankful for the sit. It feels good. But I was at a block party around the corner from the Bay Area Rescue Mission in Richmond, California, where I work. We threw a party for the Richmond community to come out and have some free food, free games, free jump houses, free live music, everything that we did was to bless as many people as possible and get them exposed to the proclamation of the gospel from the stage, and nice. Just get everybody in the same place at the same time for one reason. And it was a really great day. It was fair weather and everybody got fed. It was beautiful. It was just a wonderful day, man. It really was. We got to do a raffle and give away some cool stuff. And there was a food giveaway. People were able to take home some groceries for their houses. It was incredible.
That's awesome. Do you guys do that very often, or?
We haven't been able to do it for a while because of the COVID shutdowns. Mm-hmm. It was really bad, and California is very, let's say, ready to enforce their measures, and so we had to close down and get rid of a lot of events that we normally would have done for the community. But now we're able to do these things again, and this was the first time I think in a year and a half, 2 years.
Right on, man. Right on. That's fun. Like I wish we'd do stuff around here like that, but man, we're such a small, given that we're small, we could still do it, but we don't have that kind of stuff around here. So it'd be fun to participate in that. But yeah, let us know the next time that's going to happen. We'll kind of advertise, and if anybody's living in the Richmond area and you want to go check that out, get some free food. What did you say, Josh? Too, you guys were giving out free clothes as well, right?
There was free clothes, there was free food, there was also groceries to take home for families. There was games and jump houses and a fire truck for the kids and live music, and then we had a raffle to give away a bunch of cool stuff like cameras and a TV and a bunch of bikes for the kids. It was great.
Nice. That's awesome, brother. That's awesome. I love that. Dale Glover, what is going on, my friend? It's been a while since you have joined us. How have you been since the last time we talked with you? And how's the Shroud of Turin talks going? I know you guys and you and Teddy and everybody that dives into that. Have you guys did anything recently whenever it comes to the Shroud, or?
Yeah, well, so believe it or not, this week has been very busy for me in terms of podcasts. This is my third podcast kind of thing. So on Thursday, I did a podcast on the Shroud of Turin with Bob Rucker and Hugh Ferry. So we kind of evaluated things about like the carbon-14 dating, as well as the Hungarian Prey Codex. And then today we had Barry Schwartz, who again is a Shroud expert, on to discuss the various image forming mechanisms and why they fail. So yeah, it's been a busy day. This is my third podcast, so hopefully I don't talk about Shroud stuff today. So.
If you do, bro, just tie it in with compatibilism and we'll be good. I don't know how you would do that, but make it happen, bro. I know you can if anybody can.
God determined the Shroud images or something. I don't know.
There you go. That'll work, brother. And also, so you can tell that David is not with us tonight. He has some family things going on, and so we wish him the best. Pray for him for his safety. I know he's traveling a little bit, but we do have the two men of the hour that so how this conversation really got started. I'll give background, then I'll introduce the guys. But we had an episode on Faith Unaltered last weekend. I think it was Friday with Tim Stratton and Chris Date. And I think there was a lot of clarification brought to the subject of compatibilism and incompatibilism, determinism, and things of that nature. And so Tyler and Colton did a review on the Freed Thinker podcast. I looked at it. I loved the video, and I wanted to bring them on to ask them some questions concerning the review and concerning the topic at large. And so, guys, Tyler, we'll go ahead and start with you. For those who don't know you, brother, go ahead and introduce yourself and kind of where you stand on this whole debate of determinism, free will, compatibilism.
Yeah, so I'm Tyler. I'm the host of the Free Thinker podcast, YouTube channel, and blog. Deal with most things to do with apologetics, mostly with apologetics with like unbelievers and naturalists. I don't do a lot with like the cults and Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, I don't do anything really with cults like Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons or anything like that. But then also anything having to do with biblical or systematic theology, especially in and around issues around Reformed theology, which is where this comes into play. And I am Colton and I always forget this, Colton. We're both Presbyterian, yeah? Right? Yeah, so we're both Reformed Presbyterian. So we both are confessional, covenantal, and Calvinistic, which is where this comes in. And although we have some slight nuances in our views, we are well, I'll let him introduce himself, but I am a compatibilist, or on my softer days, I'm a semi-compatibilist. So that's where I stand. More on the far more on the Chris Date side of that discussion, and have some serious problems with Stratton's views and some of its entailments. So
okay, right on. Colton, you are up, brother man. For those who don't know you, and oh, by the way, before Colton, if you haven't saw it yet, Tyler actually, this is not his first time on the podcast. He came on to talk a discussion that I had with a guy by the name of Jesse Bloomer about universalism. We went through some clips on that episode. It was a fun time, and so I invited Tyler back to discuss this subject. But yeah, check that episode out if you're interested at all in universalism. And we are not universalists, so we were critiquing that a little bit and what Jesse was saying. But Colton, how are you doing, my friend? This is your first time on Faith Unaltered. We are happy to have you both here. It's an honor and a pleasure again to talk to you guys about this. We've kind of been talking a little bit over Messenger and off air. But Colton, for those who don't know you, go ahead and introduce yourself, brother, where you stand, where you disagree maybe a little bit with Tyler or Chris, and we'll definitely get into that. But yeah, brother, take it away.
Yeah, so I am a math teacher and a philosophy teacher at a public charter school, Mission Heights Preparatory High School. It's in Casa Grande, Arizona. It's basically a high school that prepares students for college, and it's fantastic. I love it, and I've been doing that for a couple of years since I moved to Arizona with my wife. And ever since I started teaching philosophy, I started getting more into the philosophical side of theology. So basically philosophically defending the 5 points of Calvinism, let's say. And so like irresistible grace, total depravity, and whatnot. But yeah, I actually started out Free Will Baptist or Free Grace Baptist, whatever you call it. And
okay,
in the General Association of Regular Baptist Churches growing up, I think I said a prayer when I was 6, didn't really mean anything. And then I believe that the Lord saved me when I was a teenager, when I was in high school. And then when I went to college, that's when I started studying and understanding Calvinism. And it just, I think that's the most biblical interpretation of it. So then when after college and so forth, when I got this job, I was like, oh my gosh, you can philosophically defend all this. And that's when I kind of switched from Baptist to Presbyterian, because I really liked the tradition that the Reformed tradition had. I think they were very scholarly and robust, defensive. And then when I started, this is just a side note, but when I started studying the offices between Baptist and Presbyterian, that's when I kind of like, I'm not sure I want to be Baptist anymore. I don't see any credence in it. So that's when I switched to Presbyterian. And yeah, so Tyler and I don't really have much difference in our views. So if you want to refer to kind of both of us, it's pretty much the same thing. The only thing I think we disagree on slightly is apologetics and the approach to apologetics. I think he leans more towards presuppositionalist, where I lean more towards classical, but that's a whole nother episode for a whole nother time. When it comes to compatibilism and when it comes to free will, we're going to stand side by side. And so I started this free will journey of studying free will intensely in the Reformed tradition, problem of evil regarding to Calvinism about 3 years ago or so. That's when I started getting into Guillaume Bignon's book, discovering, scholars like Chris Date, Greg Welty, James Anderson, Paul Manata, and then recently Michael Patrick Preciado. All these names are probably going to come up either from Vela or I, and I just loved it. It was just so encouraging to see people, Calvinists, being philosophers, because I don't know if you guys know, non-Calvinists kind of dominate the philosophical scene. And it was just really encouraging to see that. And so I started diving in, and it's just kind of become, I guess, my trade. And so I really enjoy it. I wish to get a master's soon in philosophy, and I want my thesis to obviously be on free will. So it's a pleasure to be on the show. So thank you so much, guys.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you, brother. Just one quick question. Was it the problem of evil, the theodicy, that propelled you kind of into the philosophical discussion on this? Or what was the thing that really propelled you into this discussion, if it wasn't that?
That's a great question. Honestly, so when I first became a Calvinist, I'm not going to say cage stage, because I really wasn't. I wasn't like hardcore about it.
Just stage, right?
Yeah. I was mainly just like, I don't see how we have free will. And obviously I didn't know the terms, and what I really meant was libertarian free will. And then when I started teaching philosophy, and then when I started, looking at apologetics and getting more into classical apologetics, that's when Platinga came up. And he's like the one who popularized the free will defense. So I read his book and I loved it. It was just glorious. But the problem that I didn't like about it was his libertarian free will. And so I started studying the differences between free will at that time. Like, can we take free will and graft it into the Reformed tradition? That's really what I wanted. Can we take determinism? But I didn't want to say hard determinism, but at the time I was confusing the two. So I started studying more, and I started thinking, like, I like this free will defense, but do we need it? Is it necessary? And so that's when I started discovering Bignon's book, and then other scholars like Fisher, Ravizza, other compatibilist scholars of the naturalistic worldview. And so it really just kind of launched off from there. I didn't even intend to like read all this much on free will. It really did start out with the classical apologetics and looking at the problem of evil, and then just launched.
Right on, man. Right on. It's amazing, like you just said, hindsight's always 20/20, right? And some of the things that I've been through as well, I never would have thought I would have done those things. You know what I mean? But looking back on those things, on those specific things, I see God in those. You know what I mean? And so it's amazing how he works and how things just come together, right? And so like I said, it's an honor, it's a pleasure to have you gentlemen here with us. Before we get started, so what had happened was I had sent Colton and Tyler some questions, and so we're going to be diving into those tonight. I've invited Dale Glover on to because Dale, could you briefly describe your position, because you do not take the same position as Tyler and Colton, and so could you briefly describe your position real quick?
Yeah, sure. So I'm not as well studied as these guys in this topic specifically, but
Neither am I.
Yeah, well, I took a philosophy of mind class like 2 years ago, so that's my extent of studies there. But I take the Molinist position. I do believe in libertarian free will. I disagree with, the theological determinism and that sort of thing. But yeah, I know I listened to the video with these two, so I know that they have very intelligent things to say, and I look forward to kind of probing them a little bit further as to why they believe the way they do in terms of determinism.
Right on. Well, let's jump into it, shall we? I guess the first question I have, guys, is Tyler, you had made a distinction between compatibilism and semi-compatibilism in your intro. What's the difference really between the two? And can you lay out a foundation for what those two positions are exactly.
Yeah, so compatibilism is the view that, and Colton can probably nuance this a bit more than me, but compatibilism is essentially the view that determinism is compatible with free will, in kind of a stronger sense. Semi-compatibilism is that determinism is compatible with moral responsibility, whatever you think about the relationship of free will as some type of control condition or anything like that. So again, it seems to me that one entails the other. So I kind of go back and forth. I'm not entirely happy with either of those. So I'm somewhere in that camp. So it really depends on how we're framing the conversation about whether or not some type of freedom that's significant or necessary for responsibility is in fact necessary, or if all you need is to show that someone can be determined and morally responsible, and you can just kind of bypass the whole free will question and just kind of be a free will skeptic of some sort. So, on my more lax days, I want to be like, well, I think the Bible is very clear in some cases that God has determined something and these people are more responsible. So, that's semi-compatibilism to a T. Other days, I think we can go much farther than that and make a stronger claim and say, no, determinism is actually compatible with a freedom worth wanting. That's a necessary condition for that moral responsibility. So,
Colton, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, so those are the definitions. Compatibilism, just simpliciter, is that free will and determinism are compatible. Semi-compatibilism kind of evades that debate, and it's often called moral compatibilism or moral compatibilism, in the fact that it's not really metaphysical. It really launches the debate and says, you can have that. So they're basically saying, like, John Martin Fisher is like the #1 semi-compatibilist that's still alive today that argues. They're also called Frankfurt style compatibilists. What they say is, you're right, libertarians, you do need the categorical ability to do otherwise. However, that's not necessary for responsibility. And we see that through Frankfurt style examples. So they bypass it, and then they say moral responsibility is really what's issue, because they take it as free will being necessary for moral responsibility. And so they go the more direct route instead of free will theists like libertarians and whatnot. They think more go towards like the indirect route. And so they think that that's how you should frame the debate in terms of moral responsibility. And then whatever bleeds afterwards, such as like guidance control, that is the kind of free will that's worth wanting that we should talk about, not the categorical, if that kind of frames it a little bit better for you. So I kind of side with Tyler. I'm more in the middle. I like V. Velen's metaphysical compatibilism, whereas she kind of puts free will at the center instead of moral responsibility. And she's what we call a dispositional compatibilist or a leeway compatibilist. So she thinks alternative possibilities are what's at stake in the free will debate, not moral responsibility or sourcehood. And I like that view. I really do. But at the same time, I keep getting drawn back to Fisher's semi-compatibilism because it is a source-based view. And I think that's really what gets intuitively at the heart of a lot of our debates regarding free will. So I kind of bounce back and forth. I don't quite see how the two are mutually exclusive. So it depends on the day. I'm with Tyler on that, but I usually defend both. In my replies to Stratton, I've defended both. So yeah, that's the general overview of the semi-compatibilism and just regular compatibilism debate.
Okay, right on. And also, guys, for our listeners, if you want to read what Colton has published on his critique of mere Molinism, I do have that linked in the description. And so you guys are more than welcome to check that out. 500 pages, brother. So my hat is tipped off to you on that one. That must have took a lot of time and a lot of effort. And so thank you for it. I'm probably I'm going to say a quarter of the way through volume 1. And so if we're repeating some of the stuff that you've already laid out, like I said in Messenger, forgive me, bro. I just haven't had time to get through all 500 pages this week, but I plan on it. And so I hope to do that soon. Guys, I want to ask you this. So you laid out a couple words there and a couple phrases, and I want to get some clarification. Colton, you said guidance control. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so guidance control has two essential parts. It was popularized by Fisher and Revisa in their book Responsibility and Control that was published in 1998. The two parts, there's a subjectivist part called Mechanism Ownership, and then there's an objectivist part, which is usually considered reasons responsive, and they call it moderate reasons responsiveness. Mm-hmm. So let's start with the objective part. The objective part says that you need to be, in order to be control of your actions, you need to have moderate reasons responsiveness. What that means is three things. You need to be strongly receptive to reasons coming into your mind. So you are aware of reasons to do this, that. Not that you have access to those things to exercise that. That would be indeterminism. But just that you're aware of things, aware of reasons for why you do what you do. That's still compatible with determinism.
So conscious to them, so to
say. So
okay.
I have reasons to kick my cat out when she's bothering me in the bathroom or something like that.
I can relate.
Something silly like that. You just have you're regularly receptive to reasons. That's the first condition of moderate reasons responsiveness. The second condition is that you're weakly reactive to those reasons. So I think in his articulation of it, Chris Date said it pretty good. I would kind of caveat it a little bit, but I would say weakly reactive is this idea that yes, we are weak-willed, but at the same time, it allows for us to be determined in one particular way. In other words, it's like a funnel. I have all these reasons coming into me regularly to do what I do. And then based off of habit, nature, nurture, whatever, how I've responded before in the past, my dispositional environment, all these things, it kind of funnels down to one, and that's the weakness of it. And so then I actually interact with that one reason to do that one thing. So it kind of slims down from all these reasons into one. And that's also why it's compatible with determinism. So that's the weakly reactive, that's the action part. So the receptive part is kind of like a cognitive power, as what Fisher and Revisa say. And then the reactive part is an executive power where I'm actually going about doing this. And it's still on action. And then the third condition of moderate reasons responsiveness is that it needs to be, that reason for doing that thing needs to be in an understandable pattern grounded in reality. What that means is I'm not just making a whim decision. I'm not just making an insane decision. It's based on my character, the history, the causal historical chain of who I am, my dispositions at that time. It's not grounded in anything else other than the reasons that were given to me and how I usually, in an understandable way, in reality, interact with those reasons. So that is it's a long theory. That is the first condition, moderate reasons responsiveness, that they have developed. The last one is the subjectivist condition is mechanism ownership. And it gets a lot of bad rap for it, but I think it's grossly misunderstood. So just briefly, it has another three conditions in that mechanism ownership. And it's just that you need to see yourself as the source of your actions. So that means you do something and you actually view yourself like I did it in a sense. Then it needs to be, in order to be own your mechanism, you need to be able to be a prime or apt candidate for reactive attitudes towards others. So if I called you a liar just randomly, Tyler, then you would be like so, and then I would have to respond to that. And so what we're doing is reacting to each other's attitudes in a certain sense. And then lastly, I need to base those two conditions, reactive attitudes, and then me seeing myself as a source in some sense of the action. I need to base those two things on the evidence. And what that means is I can see those two things actually have consequences in the real world. So I can see based on my history, if I just called someone randomly a liar, they would like look at me weird. And so I'm not going to do that. And that goes back to the moderate reasons responsiveness.
Okay.
So those two things together, mechanism ownership, the idea of taking responsibility for an action, moderate reasons responsiveness, those things together make what Fish and Revisa call guidance control.
Right on.
Long theory, but it is by far probably the gold standard of compatibilism on the market today.
Okay, fair enough.
So-
Thank you for that
So
definition.
question for clarity there, because I heard you say basically that we view ourselves as the source of our decisions.
Right.
So is this not the claim that we are in fact the source of the decision, but that we have the experience of being the source of the decision, right?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Okay.
So, of course, Fisher and Revisa are going to deny ultimate sourcehood. That's the kind of sourcehood that the libertarian has in mind, because they're compatibilists. And if they hold to that, that kind of sourcehood is incompatible with determinism, so they can't have that. And they're like, who cares? They use Fisher Revisa, or they use Frankfurt style arguments, Frankfurt style examples to show us that we don't need to be the ultimate source of our actions, nor even the sufficient source of our actions. We just need to be a source. Like Jones in the Frankfurt style example sees himself as a source. So yeah, you hit it right on the money. All we have to do is see ourselves as a source, not the source. And that's enough to own our mechanism.
Yeah, so it's a weak sourcehood condition.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So would it be appropriate to characterize that as an experiential kind of will?
It's dispositional, yes. So it's based on dispositionally our attitudes and how we relate to the environments around us.
Right, but yes. Including the thing that you said it was mechanism ownership. Including that into that part of it, it would be the experience of being the source of it. That would be, I'm supposing that would be the ground for moral blame or praise, right?
I think maybe Colton, this could simplify it. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I've understood that this condition is basically saying that this may be boiling down a little bit too much, but the agent has to be an agent. You have to kind of have this. You kind of have to have that third order awareness about that you are responsible for what you're doing. That you are a source for what you're doing. So it's kind of like that third order aboutness,
right,
of your sourcehood.
Well, that's kind of what I meant by experiential will. Right, an experience, like, because if you're saying he has a will, like this imaginary person that we're talking about has a will, right? And they have the experience of being the source, not ultimately being that source, but they have the experience of being the source, and they have the experience of emotively and rationally reacting to input, and then they actually do something where the rubber meets the road. The thought becomes action, and that action is their own through that experience. Right? Am I still following?
I don't have any objections necessarily to framing it like that.
The only caveat I would say is that I think you're setting it up in that we could falsely believe that we're a source, right? So because I think you're setting up as we think that we're a source, but we're not actually a source. And I don't think that we would agree with that. We would say that you are a source. You have a true disposition towards your actions. You are a source,
through the experience,
and you have that belief. You have that kind of you have that third order dispositional belief about it, but it doesn't necessarily translate to you are the one and only ultimate source.
Right. Well, that's why I was saying it was the experience rather than like an ultimacy.
Right. I don't mind saying experience. I think this is why I love the Reformed tradition now, because Michael Patrick Preciado has taken Fisher and Revisa's guidance control and sort of like harmonized it with Reformed theology. And if I'm understanding you correctly, at that point about like how we go about articulating mechanism ownership and the sourcehood, he uses a Reformed resource that's unavailable to Fisher and Revisa. And so his resource is the sensus divinitatis. So he uses that to kind of plug in there and say, we can't possibly not see ourselves as a source. In other words, we have to see ourselves as a source in some way because God put it there. And so however you see the sensus divinitatis, whether it's from Aquinas, Calvin, whatever, it has a huge tradition in at least Reformed epistemology. And so he uses that resource to kind of implant it in So yes, I think experience is okay. I wouldn't quite just use the word experience. I would also say that we see ourselves as a source, as a that we are prime candidates of reactive attitudes. And we see our actions actually having consequences in the world because we have a sensus divinitatis, that God has put us there as agents.
So then I guess it would be the fact that we're experiential and perceptive of the experience, right? Like like you said, we can have thoughts about our experience to recognize those things about it. That I can feel this like congruent kind of feeling of guilt when I do something, and I have the knowledge that it was wrong when I did it.
Right.
And so that, like, the equation between the experience and then the subsequent guilt, and saying those are my own.
Yeah, I wouldn't slim down, as long as we don't slim down perceptions or experience in just the physical order, and we allow for a spirituality to have some weight in there.
Right, like the existence of the soul and not just the material experience.
Then yeah. I can't see anything glaring that I would object to that.
Okay.
Dale, is there anything that you'd like to
ask them? Yeah, so I guess representing the Molinist side. So obviously you guys have given what this guidance control thing is about. I'm not going to pretend I have all 6 of the things you mentioned memorized, but what's the opposite then? What I think you guys called it regulative control, right? So what's the difference? What is that about?
So basically, regulative control is Fisher and Revisa's term to essentially give it, like, they essentially give libertarians that kind of control. So with alternative possibilities and the categorical ability to do otherwise, that entails a regulative control over your actions. So basically this idea of the garden of forking paths. So they kind of characterize it loosely like this, or at least Fisher does. Regulative control entails that we have the control to do A over B, whereas guidance control just says that I can control A or B. So I don't need to have this control to do A over B or B over A. I just need to be able to say I control A and I control B. So it's a more modest guidance control. It's a more modest sense of control for, which is why it's compatible, they claim, with determinism. And then regulative control clearly is not compatible with determinism because it allows for alternative possibilities, and determinism rules that out. So that would be the opposite.
Gotcha. Perfect. So like, yeah, so with regulative control, it's been described, they have like a dual ability type thing, right? You can will to do or will to refrain from doing any given thing. Whereas so that's the categorical ability, as you guys call it, or the conditional ability is more along the lines of what you guys would go for, right? So it's a hypothetical or conditional ability. Given these certain antecedent conditions, these are sufficient for choice A or B kind of thing. Okay.
Yeah. I normally caveat, and I was talking to Dan Chapa about a bit about this, and I really pushed the caveat. Conditional ability is not a hypothetical ability. Conditional ability is ability to do a hypothetical thing. So had conditions been different, I could have done different. So it's not that my ability is different. It's not that my ability is hypothetical. It's that I could do it under the hypothetical conditions.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So that adjective just has to move.
Colton, I got a question for you. You said, and correct this if I mischaracterize it, but regulative control, excuse me, we can control, we have the ability to control A or B, but guidance control is that we either control A or B, right? You said I control A, I control B, correct?
Right.
Okay. So I guess I'm confused. What exactly do you mean by I control anything? Because isn't it given on determinism that you're not really in control of what you are doing? Or how would you phrase that exactly?
So I think this is a huge something that sometimes not really philosophers, but some philosophers and a lot of theologians, including Stratton, get confused.
Okay.
And this idea that, if determinism is true, you can't control a single thing, or these are factors beyond your control. But the very fact is, it's just a glaring equivocation. We have a sense of control. It's just guidance control. So it's not regulative control. So all I hear when you ask that question, even if it's unbeknownst to you or unintentional, is how can I control things if determinism is true? All I hear is, right, determinism is true. You can't regulatively control it. Yes, I don't have the categorical ability to do otherwise. Right. But that doesn't mean I don't have the conditional, and that certainly doesn't mean I don't have guidance control. And so this idea that Fisher, without doing the whole Frankfurt style spiel, goes into this idea of a car. Let's just say you're turning right. And unbeknownst to you, you can only turn right because, the driver's ed instructor has manipulated the car in such a way, whereas, if you try to turn left, it would lock, or if you tried to turn, or if you tried to go straight, it would lock, or if you tried to brake, it would lock and turn right. So you can only turn right. But it just so happens in the actual sequence that you were already going to turn right. So did anything cause the steering wheel to malfunction? No. Did you know that was going to malfunction? No. All you know is that you controlled you going right.
Right.
So what I don't have in that scenario is regulative control. I couldn't go left. I couldn't go straight. I couldn't stop. But I did, in almost an intuitive sense, control the steering wheel to go right. And that's what they mean by guidance control. And that's exactly what they mean by saying we have that control condition necessary for responsibility.
Okay. It just seems like you can turn left or brake or whatever, right?
Yeah.
You could if conditions were different.
Right.
So that's the conditional. And this is, I wanted to step in and point out, because this is like I don't know if it's the most important critique that we regularly have of Stratton, but it's definitely the most common critique that we have of Stratton and others. And so I like to try to make it as clear as possible when we do it. It's that, not that you were trying to do it, but those types of objections just beg the question, right? Because so Colton's absolutely right that there's an equivocation that happens by, well, you don't have the ability, when what you've done without realizing it is the only sense of ability is categorical ability, i.e., incompatibilism is true, right? But then so you're saying I'm just going to assume in one of my definitions that incompatibilism is true. Then you're going to take that, plug it back into your question, and say, okay, if determinism is true, then it seems like I'm not in control because I've now begged the question of incompatibilism. Therefore, I can't be responsible. Therefore, compatibilism is false. Therefore, incompatibilism is true. But the only way you can trace that inferential structure, the only way you can move from that is because you've already assumed incompatibilism in what's called an enthymeme, in a hidden premise. So you've now actually assumed your conclusion in a necessary inference to make the argument work. So it's just an invalid way to argue. That doesn't make compatibilism true. That doesn't make incompatibilism false. It just means that almost every single time Stratton gives an objection of, well, if determinism is true, then it's not up to you. Well, what do you mean by up to you? If you mean by up to you regulative control, then yeah, it's not up to me. But you only need regulative control if incompatibilism is true. So you just beg the question. If by up to you, you mean guidance control, then it is up to me. And so your argument doesn't follow, right? So the arguments just are invalid because every one of his arguments, there's a step where he moves from determinism entails that we don't have this thing necessary for responsibility. But every single time he does it, that's only true if and only if we've already assumed incompatibilism is true.
So assuming incompatibilism and then trying to argue against it, or trying to argue against determinism, I see what you're saying. It is circular since one is assuming incompatibilism to begin with. That's what you're saying, Tyler?
That's right. You either, in an argument, in your dialectical, you either have to stick with a purely external critique in which case you can assume incompatibilism is true, but you need to give independent reason to accept why it's true. Or you can do an internal critique where you completely embody the other person's view, but then you can't assume these external things, and you try to basically show a reductio. But what happens when you try to kind of switch back and forth between that, you start with an internal critique if compatibilism is true, but then you make this external assumption without giving any independent reason and then feeding it back in. You've now begged the question, because you've now shifted between an internal critique and an external critique. It's just invalid. Again, doesn't make incompatibilism false. It doesn't make compatibilism true. It just means that that's a bad argument. It's actually my biggest complaint against the consequence argument against compatibilism, is that the up to you seems to just make that type of question begging assumption.
Gotcha. It's kind of like whenever we're talking with our Arminian friends, right? And they're assuming Arminianism in trying to understand limited atonement, for example, right? Yeah. It's like if you're already assuming that, okay, I get it. Let me ask you this real quick. So that nobody is inferring one thing or assuming one thing or the other, right? What I know that you got a limited time, right? So if you can't get through all this, that's perfectly fine. Just brief explanation. But what are maybe the top couple reasons that you would say that determinism or compatibilism is true?
For me, I'll let Colton answer. For me, it's scriptural. Okay. I just think it's trivially true that we have clear biblical examples where God has determined, and we have examples where he has actively controlled and caused the outcome, and the outcome just is responsible actions by agents. Mm-hmm. Right. So in Acts 2 and 4, you have very, very clear examples where God has determined, foreordained, by his hand, those types of causal languages. And we know that, Herod and Pontius and the Jews were morally responsible for their actions, but their actions are the very things that were determined. Right. We have examples, and this is where I try to give examples of where God actually causes evil things, sinful things. Mm-hmm. We have very clear examples of it. In Revelation 17, it says that God puts in the heart of people for the kings, for them to turn over their kingdoms to the Antichrist, and then they're judged for it. Right. But it expressly says that God is the one that puts that in their heart to do, and they do it. Mm-hmm. So we just have these clear examples where God determines and or causes the outcomes, and the outcomes just are responsible actions. So for me, I at a very minimal level, I just think there's a warranted biblical case for it. And compatibilism, if you have this is another critique I have of incompatibilism. Yeah. Incompatibilism is a principled position. It says, in principle, if something is determined, it cannot be free and responsible. Mm-hmm. What that does, it's a fragile position. Principled position, that doesn't mean it's weak. It just means it's fragile, because if one exception is found, it's false. Mm-hmm. And so I think that we have multiple exceptions to that in the Bible. So I think incompatibilism is just necessarily false, right? Because we have clear exceptions to it. Where the principle is just falsified, right? I'll let Colton get to that here in just a second. But so I know that you guys had said on your video that maybe Colton, you had mentioned it in your paper. Either way, basically, if it's how would I put this? If God determines just say one event, right, for the sake of the argument, right, is it more reasonable to think that God at that point would determine all events versus only determining some? Does that make sense? Basically, what I'm asking is it possible for God to determine only some events? I think, like as Stratton would say, that some things are in fact indeed determined, whereas you guys would say that no, all things are determined. Determinism's true, right? I'm not going to go with Ed. So, but yeah, go ahead, Tyler. I would probably then have different theological reasons for thinking that, right? I have grounding issues with Molinism, and then I also have I have issues seeing how someone can be a Molinist and consistently a classical theist. And so it seems to me that for God to be God is the necessary ground of all being. and that nothing would be that God has not decreed to be. Right. So God decreeing what is true in the actual world just is his determining what is true in the actual. He's determining the truth value of what's true. So if you think about it in kind of possible world semantics, if this world is world W1, well, W1 is just a set of true propositions, right? But if God is determined, is God saying, I'm going to create W1, it means that he's determined the truth value that, the true false switch will be turned to true for all of those propositions, because he's saying that's the world that's being actualized. And so he's determining that's the truth value in the actual world. And he knows that's the truth value of the actual world. And so and we're told that he upholds all things by the word of his power. So I don't even know what it means to say that something is true in the actual world that isn't determined by God, because it seems to me that would mean that's an autonomous fact free of the creative and sustaining power of God. So I just have theological issues with saying that some things are determined, but not other things.
Gotcha. Colton?
Yeah, so I pretty much am similar to Tyler. I just with a few nuances and stuff.
Yeah.
My motivations for determinism compatibilism are kind of switched. So my motivations for determinism are sometimes scriptural. I think that the crucifixion is a clear example of this, where well, I'll just leave it at what Tyler said, but I think the crucifixion is a clear example of this. I also think scriptural authority is a clear example of this, that the authors were free, yet they wrote down exactly what God intended to write down. There was no luck involved. Right. So those are just minor things. I'm not going to press it any further, but a big portion of why I lean more towards determinism has to do with determining grace and monergism. And so I think, and I try to lay this out in my volume 1 reply to Stratton in the historical theological section, but that is a huge motivation for me. I think that the irresistible grace must be, just grace in general for salvation must be determining. And it has to, in order for it to be specifically monergistic. And I'm almost positive Tyler's going to agree with me here. So for that fact alone, I think, we have to have some sense of determining aspect to it, so that God gets all the praise and we get none of the praise. But then that just follows that a lot of the T, the U, the P, and so forth just follow from the I. I think all of the 5 points kind of intermingle together.
They're all connected.
That's a huge motivation for why I am a determinist. And then also a compatibilist, just because I do believe that the Bible is unequivocally clear that we are morally responsible and free in our actions. It's not clear how that freedom or responsibility is cashed out in terms of philosophy. So I don't think, just like Stratton uses all the time or other incompatibilists, 1 Corinthians 10:13, I do not see at all how that teaches that you can just have regulative control over actions. Not at all. Why? Because the context doesn't give you a philosophical debate on whether or not libertarianism or compatibilism is true. It just says you're free, you make choices, and you're responsible for those choices. Fantastic. The compatibilist agrees. So in that sense, I'm I take all those measures together, and I think that the Bible is clear. We're free, responsible, so compatibilism. And I also, for a lot of the reasons Tyler gave, that's why I'm a determinist.
Okay, right on. I appreciate that. Dale, I know you had a question, and then after that, if this doesn't go off in another direction, I'd like to come back to free, to that language. But go ahead, Dale.
Yeah, cool. So 2 questions. So Tyler, dang you stole my question for them. Because I heard you guys in the video, you kind of critiqued Tim Stratton, saying, look, he's not justifying why regulative control or why libertarian freedom is sufficient or necessary for freedom, kind of thing. And he's not providing arguments or reasons for that in your guys' view. So I wanted to put it to you guys, what are your guys' reasons? And you guys are saying mainly theological or scriptural. Just the first question of 2, do you guys also think there are good philosophical arguments that favor compatibilism? And if so, what would those be?
I think there are good arguments. I think a rollback argument, it works. It seems to me it's somewhat theological. You could almost do a theological rollback argument where if God knows that I'm going to do X and I do X and we keep rolling it back and we keep rolling it back, I'm going to do X 100% of the time. And so it's hard to understand how, if I could do in an indeterministic way where no antecedent condition causally determines the outcome, it at least seems that there would be some difference, right? I would have some percentage where I wouldn't do X, but then that seems to be that you would violate divine foreknowledge, right? So there are lots of divine foreknowledge arguments. I actually, Colton, I don't know if you had a chance to think about it a little bit more. I once proposed kind of a blending of a Frankfurt example and a divine foreknowledge combined that I think gets around the flicker of freedom response that some people get. So I think there are lots of reasons. I think there are lots of philosophical reasons for why we also ought to be compatibilists and determinists.
Cool. And Colton, yeah.
Yeah, so I think I do agree. I think that the divine foreknowledge problem is just easier to solve with determinism is true. It is just easier. Instead of going the Occamism route or soft facts, hard facts, brute facts, or just trying to give a model for, like, if you're a simple foreknowledge theist, trying to give a model that doesn't just entail determinism like David Hunt, it's really difficult to do. And so I take Dave Hunt's model, which is basically, he's a simple foreknowledge theist, and he does use Frankfurt style examples to show a model that, oh, God can simply foreknow what Jones will do, but yet Jones is free in the libertarian sense. And I think it's hilarious because, like, philosophically hilarious, because so many people have critiqued that model, including incompatibilists, and they have said it just entails determinism. What do you mean? And I'm like, yep, precisely. That's the point. That's literally what we're trying to say. Paul Helm says something very similar in the Four Views of Foreknowledge book. And so I think that's very convincing. If we take Fisher's specific divine incompatibility of freedom and foreknowledge, freedom being libertarian freedom, that argument is just sound to me. And I think the Molinists, if they want to try to argue the consequence argument against the Calvinists, they're going to have some real big issues when we press it back on them, the exact same argument when it comes to foreknowledge and freedom. Just, that's a side note, but yeah, I find that argument really sound. And so I echo what Vela just said here.
I would also give, I mean, this isn't necessarily an argument against these, but it's gotten to the point, Colton, I don't know if you've had this a similar experience where when I'm reading some of the newer and the current, work coming out from people like Philip Swinson and others from, libertarian and incompatibilist side, it's starting to almost read like sci-fi. Like you're starting getting into like time travel and reverse dependence. And there's almost a certain point where it's like, if you got to do all that to rescue the theory, and these other ones are so simple.
It does seem to violate Occam's razor heavily. And so I don't mind the sci-fi and stuff like that and the time travel, because if it's logically possible, then technically it fits. But it's still at the same time, like, I am going to pull a date, and I think he did wonderful when he pulled the Occam's razor. And I think this is one way that we can pull Occam's razor and say, listen, how does God foreknow? He determined it. Done.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And we just completely evade the whole debate, and it's awesome.
Yeah. And I think I pointed this out too in other episodes. We've talked about this. The one thing that I think most people think Molinism and free will have going for it is that it helps resolve the problem of evil.
Right.
But I've argued, I think successfully, and shown that free will actually doesn't do the spade work of solving the problem of evil, because there are clear counterexamples where God could have protected the free choice, but still intervened to prevent the outcome of the choice and prevented the evil. And so free will actually isn't the mechanism or the machine that solves the problem of evil. You then have to appeal to these other morally sufficient reasons like soul building and all these other kind of stuff. And so, like, the one thing that people, I think, think that it does really well, I think it's pretty limp. I don't think it actually does very much.
And then it just backfires into a theodicy or defense that the compatibilist Calvinists can use, like soul building or something like that, or skeptical theism or greater good. Yeah. And if that's the case, well, then what's the problem?
Yeah.
Awesome. I know it's about your guys' views, and I'm just interviewing, but I would say I agree with you guys 100%. As a Molinist, I have my Molinistic defeater. Free will is part of the story, but that's not the end of the thing. There's that greater good to get to that end state kind of thing, the eschaton. Yeah. All right, cool. But so my second question for you guys, and then I'll shut up and give it back to Tyler. So I think that you guys maybe missed something with Tim Stratton when you were reviewing him, because he referenced something in the show that might provide that gap as to why regulative control is needed and guidance control is not enough. And he mentioned proper basicality. So for me, it's not necessarily arguments. Again, I'm not as knowledgeable as you guys in the literature there. But for me, I think that, anything less than regulative control or that categorical ability is insufficient. And I think for most common people, it's because in a properly basic way, we know this. So I wanted to put it to you guys, what do you guys think of using properly basic beliefs to fill that gap or something?
Yeah. So I only have about 10 more minutes left, so I'll say my piece, and because this is going to start. We have addressed this in a different episode. Okay. I think both of us just call foul. Both of us are just throw a red card. Sorry, flag on the field, and say a couple things. One of them is that the literature flat out shows the exact opposite conclusion. So study after study, meta-studies, meta-analysis shows that that folk intuitions are not libertarian. They're not deterministic. The folk intuition is just messy. It depends on how it's phrased. It depends on the thought experiments. The same person will have opposite intuitions if you change the actual thought experiment. Like, it's just messy. So it's just not accurate that people have that there's this folk intuition of libertarian freedom. It's just not the case. And the other thing that I'll say is when it comes to proper basicality, I also think that there's an equivocation and a smuggling in of concepts that's happening. I think if you want to say that we have a properly basic belief that we are free and responsible, right? That sure, I could probably get down with that. But the question is, well, do I really have the properly basic belief that I have metaphysically real options of a categorical ability based on a leeway condition where I have the ability to actualize metaphysically diverse things from what God foreknew that I would do? No, that's not a properly basic belief. That's way too much metaphysical baggage, I think, to be in there. When really, I really strongly, this is my intuition. Okay. And I had this before I was reflecting back on my life. I'd ask you, I'd be like, is that really your properly basic belief? Or do you just have the belief that you're free and no one's forcing you to do what you do? That to me is like the base, that's the properly basic belief is I'm not being forced. I'm doing what I do. I'm not being forced again. There's nothing forcing me against my will, right? That to me feels like the actually properly basic belief starting point that we all share. But that's compatible with compatibilism.
I'm glad you brought that up, Tyler. And Colton, go ahead. I was going to ask a question since Tyler's got to leave. Colton, do you have to leave as well, or can you hang out for a little bit longer?
Free. Let's go.
Okay. All right. Bet. So I had mentioned this on Messenger, and Colton, I know you responded, but Tyler, I want to get your thoughts as well on this. But do you guys believe, or I know Colton said he does. Tyler, you believe that the decree transcends space-time, right? And what I mean by that is surpasses the limits of space-time.
Generally, I'd say yes.
Because what I'm getting at there is the decree. There's a connection in between what we do and the decree. Correct?
The question is messy. So the decree isn't like a substance.
No, I agree.
A thing or a being, right? We would say God transcends. I don't know. I would say, I think I know what you're getting at. And I would say, yes, the decree transcends, the creation, but it's not like the decree is this thing that is outside and transcends creation, right? Well, I mean, it's also not like God is a thing. So when you get into classical theism and stuff, so I can tentatively say yes, because I know what it's like when people ask, like, did the decree come before creation? Well, I mean, technically before is a temporal term, so it's a sloppy question, but yes, we all know what you mean.
Okay.
I know what you mean, so yes, but depending on where you go, I may have to backtrack and get a little bit more nitpicky.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Nitpicky is good. Nitpicky is where we find truth, right? And so my question is, you said that nothing's causing or forcing us to do things. How is the decree not doing that?
Well, yeah, the decree is just determinative of what will be true in the actual world, right? So it's not that it's not that a decree is like it's like the ether. It's like this thing in creation that at every point it's like immediately causally causing something to happen. The decree is God speaking creation, right?
Okay.
Into existence, this creation, this actual world, right? So especially as a Calvinist, I'm gonna say God has decreed from before the foundation of the world who would be his, right? But does that mean that at every single step of the way, God was forcing and causing against my will as an immediate act? Like I was merely a pawn without any type of sourcehood, agency, guidance, control, any of that to my, well, no. Although as a Calvinist, I'm going to say when I was dead, I had no ability to do any type of activity that is pleasing to God or to bring about my justification. But it's not that I was like not an agent and I was just like a passive cog of a deity of deception or whatever that silly language is.
Gotcha. Colton?
Yeah, I don't really have much to say. I think I agree.
So. Okay. Right on. Josh, you've been awful quiet, brother. Is there anything that you want to bring to the table before Tyler has to leave, or you're muted?
To be honest with you, my internet is still jumping around quite a bit, so I'm trying to be careful about when I intervene because I'm not sure how long it's going to take before it jumps around again. But
well, you're pretty solid. So if you got a question,
yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say that I'm very pleased that you gentlemen came on here and you've been such good sports. This is really great, and I couldn't be happier with how this went. You're very thorough. Both of you were very careful with your words, and this has been very peaceable. So I've enjoyed myself, and I'm glad that you were here, Tyler.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And so since you have to go, I don't want to necessarily ask anything too complex, but I just kind of I hear a lot of this this back and forth and how Tyler just asked about it, and usually the response is God doesn't have to come in and force me against my will. That's because the presupposition is that the will is operative within the decree and it can't actually be otherwise. So he wouldn't have to go against the will, right? Like there's no immediate intervention or cause or coercion. I think the word is what would be used is God's not coercing or going, or like you said, causing me to go against my will by interrupting, right?
Well, no, because there are clear scriptural examples where God causes and hardens Pharaoh's heart, right?
Right. That's basically to consider his resolve more firm than it was before. Like God made him more stubborn in the direction he had already decided. Yeah.
No, I mean, I disagree. I don't think so.
Okay.
I think exegetically, and I do this on one of my episodes. I think exegetically, God hardens his heart first. So,
okay.
and it says that by God's purposes, that's why he put Pharaoh there, right? So you can actually say that God was the one decreeing and determining that he put Pharaoh there for the purpose to harden him and to bring that about. So the question is, well, could Pharaoh have done other than the purpose that God intended for him to do? It gets into a sticky wicket of, well, did God, this is where the divine foreknowledge arguments start coming in, right? Did God foreknow that Pharaoh would deny allowing the children of Israel to go? And if you say, oh, well, he has, right? So this is really quickly, this is the divine foreknowledge problem, right? So if God is God, right, and he's infallible in his knowledge, infallible means it is not possible for God to be wrong.
Correct.
Right. So if there's any sense where it's possible for God's knowledge to be wrong, you've denied infallibility. Right. So, but when you say, okay, well, God foreknew that Pharaoh wouldn't allow the Israelites to go. Right. Could Pharaoh have chosen to allow the Israelites to go? If you say yes, what you've said is it is possible that there's a state of affairs in which God's knowledge, really, it would be his belief, was wrong. Right. So just by simply,
or that he would know something else.
But well, no, because we've already established God knows Pharaoh will not let them go. Right. He knows it.
Okay.
Let's call it 100 years before. He knows it. In fact, he knows it.
Is that subsequent to the decree, or is the decree based on that foreknowledge?
Well, you can't say that. So this is where I push back on the Molinists, right? Because you can't say so prior to the decree, it's middle knowledge, right? It's what would take place in certain conditions, right? Okay. Subsequent to the decree, it's what will take place, right? Given Molinism.
Right.
So you have to remember, the Molinist is going to say that the libertarianly free choice is the truth condition for what God knows, right? But think about what that does in the argument. So now you have in the hypothetical middle knowledge, Pharaoh was libertarianly free, but now God has decreed what will be in the actual world. And so in the actual world, God has infallible knowledge of what Pharaoh will do. So in the actual world, can Pharaoh do otherwise? You seemingly have to say no. Otherwise, it's possible that something would falsify God's knowledge. But the instant you do that, Pharaoh isn't libertarianly free. And so Pharaoh is more free in middle knowledge than in the actual world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, correct. I agree with that. And I think you're right, is that once the world that God chose to actualize is actualized, it is only his intervention that's going to change something. But that also would be based on his foreknowledge. As you said, he can't be incorrect.
Right, but then at that point, we don't have libertarian freedom in the actual world. We had libertarian freedom in the hypothetical world prior to the middle knowledge.
I think that's why the claim of Sourcehood is
that we don't have libertarian freedom because we don't have the categorical ability to do otherwise.
Right. I think that's why the claim of the Sourcehood is actually a crucial aspect of how that comes together. Go ahead, Dale. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
No problem. So I know he has to go, so I'll just ask this very quickly, and I'd also like Colton's opinion on this. So, what if somebody said, "Well, look, God, in terms of his knowledge, it is logically possible, even with his free knowledge, once the actual world is created, it is logically possible that we do otherwise than God knows will happen, but it's not metaphysically possible. It's infeasible that would happen." If someone makes that distinction, do you think that would help solve that issue at all? Or
I think you would still be on a sticky wicket. It seems like you'd still be denying infallibility. And the other thing I would say, well, once you make that distinction, you seem to just be granting the conditional ability. Then that just seems right. So you then seem to be saying the only way I can get out of it is now to go to say, well, libertarian freedom just collapses now to conditional ability, which I'm going to go and say, well, then just start with that and avoid the problem of falsifying infallibility. You can have the best of both worlds rather than having a diminish of both of them. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure why it would become a conditional thing. So maybe I just need to rethink
because what you're saying is now they don't have the metaphysically they don't have the categorical ability to do others. They actually couldn't do the other thing. It's metaphysically closed to them, right? It's a Frankfurt case. It's metaphysically closed to them. But had conditions been different, had they wanted to, had God's knowledge been different, had God decreed a different world, however you want to do that, cash it out. You're now saying they have a conditional ability, and that somehow rescues it.
But it is their will that's closing off the metaphysical possibility, right? Like
it's a conditional about the will. It's had the will been different. then it would have been possible. But then again, then you're just at a conditional analysis, and you're at a conditional analysis now that still risks infallibility, right? You now have to define infallibility in only in the metaphysical sense, but not in the conditional sense. And I'm going to say, well, you've now given up libertarian categorical ability and you've weakened infallibility. Why not just not give up? Why not have a conditional and not give up a weakened sense of infallibility and just be a compatibilist? You get the best of both worlds.
Gotcha. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. And Colton, if you have time, like, or whatever you guys are doing, Tyler.
I got to jump, but I want to hear Colton's response to it, and then I'm done talking though. But so thank you, gentlemen, very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for coming on, Tyler. It's been a pleasure as always, brother. Go ahead, Colton.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I could say anything that would fill in the gaps for what Vela said. I haven't studied the foreknowledge argument deeply myself. I know that the other side, those who believe the compatibility of libertarian freedom and foreknowledge, they will retort back with a myriad of different responses. But I do find, just right now where I am, I do find what Vela is saying convincing. I'm not going to try to, though, fill in the gaps because that's not what I've studied. So I'm not going to pretend that I've studied it more than Vela or whoever. So I'll just leave it at that. I know it's probably unsatisfying, but
no. Thank you guys. I appreciate your answers. Cool. Thanks.
Right on. So Josh, do you have anything else? Because I know that you were kind of in the middle of a conversation there. If not, I want to jump back to Sourcehood for just a second. But go ahead.
Actually, the Sourcehood was exactly what I was going to be aiming at. Is ultimately, I think the distinction that really is made there is that foreknowledge comes prior to the decree for Molinism, and it's absolutely exhaustive foreknowledge in which probability, possibility, and impossibility are all equally known, and God can decide freely from among them, and that we are the source. Ultimately speaking, we're actually the source of the determination in that way. I don't know the exact terminology for it. There's probably a better way of phrasing that, but the idea that we're actually ultimately the source and not just having the perception of sourcehood or being a source, but being the source, and that being part of God's knowledge and him deciding between it, the decree or that predestination of all things that Stratton talks about, I think being after knowledge makes a difference to where, because if there's something that ties us directly to the decision in a way that informs the decree rather than the decree informing the decision, I think that's actually a valid distinction. So I'm just kind of curious how that plays in. I'm not sure if that's where you were going next, but that's kind of where my mind was going there.
Yeah. I mean, what I was going to say basically is that it seems like a lot of weight, all of the weight really hangs on the decree. And like Tyler said, if the decree would have been something else, then X would have happened instead of Y, right? Or the other way around. And so I guess I'm trying to still understand, because I know you guys said that we're not the ultimate source, but we are a source. And if those decisions don't come from us, don't stem from us, my question is, how are we a source at all? Is it that the actions that we're perpetrating the actions, so to say, that we're perpetrating our thoughts, our desires, which lead to those actions? I guess that's where I'm still kind of confused on the source language, is that, how, like I said, if all of the weight hangs on the decree and I can't do Y unless the decreed that I would do Y, or God decreed that I would do Y. Let me rephrase that. I don't understand how I'm a source at all. So
right. So I think there's a couple ways to approach the question. It could just be incredulity. So you can't understand how. And so if that is the argument, which I'm not saying that's the argument, but
sure,
or that's what you're saying. But if someone were to approach me like that and it's like, and people have, and compatibilists have, and say like, I can't understand if God determines all things, how you can be a source at all. Stratton is one of them who has approached me like that, then I'm just going to say that's personal incredulity, which is a fallacy, and I need to see an argument. So
Gotcha.
that's one way to approach it. Another way to approach it is by using actual models. So like Frisch and Revisa have actually modeled what a source would look like through Frankfurt style examples.
Mm-hmm.
So unless you guys want me to explain a Frankfurt style example, which I can, but essentially I don't see why Jones could not be a source in the Frankfurt style example. He deliberated, he chose, nothing forced him, nothing compelled him, nothing manipulated him in the actual sequence of events, yet he could not do otherwise. So if, let's just say, as Tempe would say, sourcehood, ultimate sourcehood, entails some sense of alternative, indeterminate, categorical ability.
Mm-hmm.
If that's the case, and if we take a Frankfurt style example, then yes, it's true. He doesn't have the source, as in the ultimate sourcehood that libertarians are after, because Frankfurt style example, if done right, he doesn't have alternatives. So via modus tollens, he can't be the ultimate source. But does that mean that we should honestly give up that he is like at all, like no source at all? I can just side by many incompatibilists who have said, no, that's false, including libertarian defender Robert Kane. He's even willing to grant, and he's no friend of compatibilists
Right.
and no friend of Frankfurt style arguments. He's even willing to grant that Jones can be a deliberative source. Perryboom, who's a free will skeptic, is willing to grant and even argue that he is a source in a certain sense, though he agrees that moral responsibility entails that alternatives are necessary in some sense, yet he just says we don't have it. So he's a hard incompatibilist instead of like the other side, the libertarian, who's like a soft incompatibilist.
Sure.
But he's an incompatibilist who still agrees and uses Frankfurt style examples, who says that we can still be a source. So that's, if I want to be more offensive, I would go that route. If I want to be more defensive, I would just say, where's the argument? I don't
Right.
see it. So I'm not going to just claim that intuitively we need to be the ultimate source of our actions. The third thing I would say is from Carolina Sartario. She has a brilliant little argument in her book from 2016 called Causation and Free Will, in her chapter on ultimacy. And it basically shows the question-begging nature of this. How does it do that? Well, it kind of draws aspects from Tempe, and it basically says, well, your objection is that we don't have the causal access to actions. That's why we're not the source, right?
Mm.
But then she's like, but that just is determinism, because determinism necessarily rules out that we have categorical causal access to that. So yeah, we can't be the source. So what's going on here? She claims that the only reason why people claim that we need to be the source, the ultimate source, and that's necessary for moral responsibility, is just because they think determinism is the problem. But determinism is only the problem if it's argued to be the problem. You can't approach the debate by just saying determinism is the problem and then, claim victory and say sourcehood.
Right.
That's not how it works. And so in volume 1 of my reply to Stratton, I actually talk about that in section 2.22, where I talk about the location of determinism and how the location of determinism matters with regards to our sourcehood. And so I actually use that same argument against Stratton's claims for him punting to sourcehood to somehow vindicate libertarian freedom. And so I don't see how it works. So those three, just brief, I know I say brief, but those three responses is what I would say to any sourcehood claim.
And I think that's part of the problem is, I haven't read through all your paper yet. I haven't read, what did you say her name was? Sartorio?
Carolina Sartario.
Can you send me a link to her book whenever
Right,
we get
yes.
done? Okay, that'd be great. And like I said, it's probably because I haven't, it's not clicked because I haven't studied it as much as you guys have, and so I want to do that because, like I said, this show and not even the show, just me personally, like I'm about seeking truth. I want to know the truth, no matter what I call myself at the end of it. I just want to know what is true and what's not. And so I appreciate you guys, you coming on and really helping and further this discussion. Like, I really think there's a lot of clarification that's being added. It might seem like you guys are repeating yourselves to you, you know, but I really just, you know, for my sake, I really appreciate it. I guess, you know, I sent you guys the questions, and I'm sitting here looking at number 9, but I'll ask it, but it seems kind of like it would go back, just me kind of glancing at it, it would go back to what we're talking about with sourcehood, right? So let me just read it, and then I'll get your opinion on it, Colton. But basically,
sorry. Is it okay if I just ask Joshua? I was saying I could ask a quick question about the Frankfurt thing. It'll take 2 seconds, and then
no, that's why you're here, brother. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, cool. Thanks. No, I didn't want to interrupt, but so I just wanted to ask you, Colton. So I know that a lot of people bring up the Frankfurt cases as like,
right,
you know, it destroys categorical ability and that sort of thing. But to me, and I know you've written on this because I did scan this in your volume 1, I think it was, but I go for the option of William Lane Craig, right? You know, it's about the categorical ability to will to do or will to refrain from doing. And even in these Frankfurt cases, they still have that categorical ability. So I just wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, so I've written on that in volume 1, yeah, for sure. And I just, before I actually answer that, I want to say that I actually don't think that precisely for that reason, for what you brought up, but I'm going to nuance it a little bit, that I don't think that Frankfurt style examples just destroy categorical alternatives. I actually don't think that they are successful, and this is something that Vela and I actually disagree with, but I don't think that they're successful when showing PAP to be false, so the principal alternative possibilities. And the reason why is specifically because either a flicker of freedom, and that flicker of freedom you can still press no matter how much that manipulative mechanism that the neurosurgeon puts into Jones in the alternative sequence to go off on the alternative sequence, no matter how far he presses it into the mental substrate, he's still going to have just a small flicker of freedom. And if the debate, dialectical context, is on the compatibilists, it is their job to show, without doubt, that the alternatives are not there. Now, because traditionally it is the first step to show compatibilism to be true, to get rid of alternatives, and that means it's usually positioned in the dialectical framework to be on the compatibilist. What I say is I actually disagree with Fisher here. I know he's like the champion of Frankfurt style examples, but I actually agree with the incompatibilist here in that I don't think, because it's our burden, I don't think we can do that. And if that's the case, then we're at a disadvantage. We could be question begging here. So what should we do instead? And I will go back to your question in a bit. I think we should reframe the dialectic and instead use it somehow how Perryboom uses it, and just to show that sourcehood is necessary in some sense. That's it. Not to position the Frankfurt argument against PAP, like Frankfurt originally wanted to do. We should instead position it as an argument for sourcehood or a defense of sourcehood. And I think that evades the alternative possibility condition, and it still at least shows us that Jones could deliberate in the actual sequence, chooses in the actual sequence, and is indeed an agent in the actual sequence. Yes, he doesn't have categorical alternatives and blah, 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 but he's still an agent. And so I actually use that to show that determinism, even if true, we can be an agent. So you can read all of that in volume 1. So all of that caveat to say, I agree with you. I do like the William Lane Craig distinction, and Stratton actually uses it notoriously in his book about free will thinking, that they can will to think. However, I don't think that Stratton can afford himself that much, because I'm going to use Tempe's, and I'm going to use Tempe's model, and I'm going to say, even if Frankfurt style examples are true, they still press that coercive alternative sequence mechanism so far back in the mental substrate, not to get rid of alternatives, but to weaken them. And if the debate is on the compatibilists, then weak alternatives are just as alternatives, like strong. It doesn't matter if they're weak or strong, they're still alternatives. But then I can say, well, if Stratton wants to argue against Frankfurt style examples, they're really weak. And if I'm going to use it defensively, I can actually use that against him. and I can say, how is it possible that weak, deliberative, willing, categorical alternatives in that sense are actually robust enough for rational responsibility? And I don't really see how, specifically because he thinks that rational responsibility entails epistemic duties to obey or disobey, and those are strong alternatives. In the words of Alvin Plantinga, those are significant alternatives for free will, to do this or to do that, or the liberty of contradiction. And the weak alternatives, what Frankfurt style's examples show, is that we only have weak alternatives, not the liberty of contradiction, but instead we have the liberty of contrariety, to will or to will this or to will that. And if I want to put it in terms of, let's just say, theological matters, to sin this way, to sin that way, to sin that way, to sin that way. What don't I have if Frankfurt style examples are true? I don't have the ability to sin or not to sin. I don't have that. So in other words, if Stratton's correct that rational responsibility entails epistemic duties to do, to obey or disobey, I don't have that in Frankfurt style examples. I only have the ability to, for weak alternatives, to disobey for the unregenerate, to disobey this way, to disobey that way, to disobey this way, but I don't have the liberty of contradiction. That's terrible for his view, especially if his view needs the contradiction here, and Frankfurt style examples don't grant it. So that's a long-winded answer. I hope that makes sense, but if you have any pushback, then feel free.
I like that, actually. I think there's something for me to think through in there. So yeah, I'm going to listen back to this and kind of reflect on what you said. So thank you so much.
Yeah, feel free to let me know when you read my section on Frankfurt style examples and how I position it specifically against Stratton. I think it's really good, but we can go back to Tyler's question if you want.
Well, you remember how earlier you said that sometimes you kick your cat out of the room? I think she's wishing that you would do that right about now. Look behind
you.
So
I'll probably do that.
Abuse to animals, Tyler. You're so mean.
Look, it's a cat, and so I categorically just separate that kind of animal from every other type. Maybe not a spider, but no, I have a cat and I love him to death. So actually,
out of interest, what are you and Tyler? You and Joshua? Are you guys where do you guys stand on this debate? I'm just curious.
So
I'm a libertarian.
Yeah, and so I've been a Calvinist now for the last 5 years, and have really just been getting into this conversation. Josh and I have talked about it for years, but ever since that we had Chris and Jeremiah and Andrew Elliott on to talk about this, right? That's whenever I started diving into that. So I'm going to say that was at least a year ago now, maybe. So I've been diving into the subject about a year, and I guess I'm kind of I don't want to say I'm on the fence anymore, but I do lean libertarian. But I think that I still have a lot of work to do on this. So it's not like I'm on a hill, libertarianism is true, like I'm willing to die for it or anything like that. I could definitely be persuaded back. But as I find myself right now, I feel like I'm leaning more Molinist or libertarian right now anyway. So yeah.
I think that's fair. I think that's probably a good way of answering that. Tentatively, I think that libertarian freedom, it has more explanatory power for me and is more intuitive. But I can say also that I am very receptive to new information, and I'm one of those weirdos that's willing to be proven wrong. I've changed my mind a lot of times. Tyler knows already. I try my best to be fair and understand before I say I disagree. And I think that if somebody staged to me something that made sense of things in a way that libertarian freedom didn't, then I would be willing to change my mind. So, but as it stands, I think that was a good answer, Tyler. I agree with you. That was good.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I don't have that problem because I'm never wrong. So I never have.
Well, you and David might be related, bro.
I'm telling you.
Bad joke. Go ahead, Tyler.
Yeah. So if our listeners want to jump in and ask questions, we are taking questions now. I did put that up on the screen a minute ago, but Paul Manata actually had a question. I asked him to rephrase it a little bit because of the way he put it. But Colton, maybe you can pick up on where he's coming from. But he asked me to ask you this. But he says, let's see, let's put it up on the screen. But, and he clarifies here, is it? But so I'm assuming this means, but is it whether that morally relevant? And so I know it was going back to whenever you guys were discussing Frankfurt and and those things.
First of all, I love Paul Manata. He's a friend of mine, and he's actually helped me a lot with just looking at the Reformed theology and answering some objections to like God's blameworthiness and so forth. And I've read some of his papers, and he's great. He's fantastic. And so, morally relevant. So in my section of Frankfurt style examples, I try to show that because there's tons of different terminologies out, I use liberty of contrariety, and I say that's like morally relevant. So I think that alternatives, if positioned on the compatibilist, if Frankfurt styles examples, if the debate is on the compatibilist, I don't think they should have any alternatives available. So Guillaume Bignon actually takes the same side here with Frankfurt style examples. And if the debate is actually on the compatibilist and the Frankfurt style arguments are arguments to either go against PAP or for compatibilism or something like that, or the first step towards compatibilism, then they need to show alternatives are completely gone, which means all flickers are completely gone. I don't think they can, and I'm going to side then with the incompatibilist Tempe here. And so I think at best, they get rid of strong alternatives. McKenna, and I think Michael McKenna says something similar in his. They get rid of strong, in his version of Frankfurt style examples, they get rid of strong alternatives, but they don't get rid of weak alternatives. I call those weak alternatives the flicker of freedom, or a weak flicker, or I can also call them the liberty of contrariety, that Jones has the ability to will this sin, if we're going to frame it theologically, this sin, that sin, that sin, or that sin. So sin 1, sin 2, sin 3, sin 4, whatever. And if the debate is positioned on the compatibilist and they have the burden, then those are indeed, I think, to the incompatibilist, morally relevant. So I'm not quite sure what Manata is trying to ask, but I do use that terminology in there. I think that they're morally relevant. But the problem is Stratton wants to claim that they're rationally significant, which is the liberty of contradiction, the ability to sin one and also do righteous one, to obey or disobey rationally. That's what his free thinking argument is about. He has claimed that over and over and over and over again in his book, Rejoinder to Bignon podcast, and his latest article with Moreland. So I don't think, though, he can afford that position. So even if I were to switch the dialectical gears on the Frankfurt style examples, use it defensively instead of offensively, I can still press it against him and say, see, weak flickers, but your view entails strong flickers or liberty of contradiction. But you can't do that. So either way, you have a problem. And so I'm not sure if that answers Manata's claims, but I do like that distinction, morally relevant for weak flickers or liberty of contrariety, or morally significant for strong flickers or liberty of contradiction. I use all those vocab terms interchangeably as I kind of show this to be the case.
They're kind of synonymous with each other, right?
I take them to be synonymous, right?
Gotcha. Yeah. Also, Paul, if that didn't answer your question, please feel free to rephrase it, and we'll put it up. And also consider coming on the show. I'd love to talk to you about this a little bit more in depth. And so I know we have a couple more audience questions, and then I do want to get to that question line because I think it's relevant, obviously, to this discussion, and I'm just curious. I'm curious how you would answer this, but let's get to irresistible truth real quick. He asked, "Is God the source of our sourcehood being established?"
I would say yes, but not I don't necessarily like the way he worded the question, but I know what he's trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have this sensus divinitatis, we can't fail to be just sources of our actions. So that's what Preciado tried to argue in his book, A Reformed View of Freedom. So if we have that and it's given to us, and we are made in the image of God, we have this innate sense that we are held accountable, that we are blameworthy for our sins, and that there is a God. So based off Romans 1, at least that's what Preciado tries to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And other historical arguments he uses to show it. But given that, yes, God is the source of our sensus divinitatis, if that's the case. So yes, but I wouldn't necessarily frame it like that.
Gotcha. Dale or Josh, is there anything that you would like to either piggyback on or push back on?
No, I think that's I think he covered that pretty well. I'm actually interested in the next question there.
Jamie's question, you mean?
Affirmative.
Gotcha. So Jamie asked this: if the sense of libertarian free will in everyday life is false and a mistake of reasoning, on what grounds can you establish that God's choices aren't determined as well?
And I'm assuming that Jamie means by libertarian free will that ultimate sourcehood that we were asserting earlier.
Well, a couple things. So I guess I'll go to the less contentious part of it. And God's choices aren't determined. No, I don't think God's choices are determined. And that would be, I think, a mistake or even a category mistake. So I don't think God can be determined by anything other than his own nature. And even then, by his own nature, it kind of seems weird to say. I just don't think God is determined. And I think he's indeterminate in that way. But that's not to say that he doesn't have reasons for what he does. So he must have reasons for what he does. And we can say that he does things because of reasons, that they're not arbitrary, that they have a purpose, and that he has a end game, what Stratton says all the time, or he's looking at the eschaton. So he has a purpose for those things. Are those reasons determinative? I'm going to still say no, but it does press against, I think, a libertarian agenda here. So what is God's freedom like? It's hard to say. He's definitely the source of his actions. At best, he's a source and compatibilist. So he can't be determined and also the source at the same time. But does that necessarily entail libertarian freedom? No. Just because you're indeterminate doesn't mean that you're libertarianly free. And that's a mistake Stratton, among many popular apologists, actually make, actually including William Lane Craig. Just because you're indeterminate doesn't mean you're automatically libertarianly free.
Okay. You're
just indeterminate. Why? Because indeterminism is not a sufficient condition for libertarian freedom. And if you want to argue that it is, then you have a really huge luck objection just glaring in your face, which, good luck, pun intended. Like,
nice.
Try to figure that out. So at best, most incompatibilists are going to say indeterminism is a necessary condition for libertarianism, and I side with that. So just because God is indeterminate doesn't mean he's libertarianly free. He makes choices, he's the source, and in that sense he has incompatibilist nature. But the way we cash out the source could be something very similar to the way compatibilists cash out the source, and that's going to be similar to Tempe's view, who argues similar Frankfurt style examples, or Pereboom's view, or whatever, and they're both incompatible. So it's very similar. With regards to the above, the first part of his question, in the sense of everyday life is false and mistaken reasoning, I don't think it's necessarily mistaken reasoning. I just don't think that's intuitive as much as people think it is. And I think Vela, when he was on, he showed that to be the case. We make choices. That is intuitive. We are morally responsible for our actions. That is intuitive. Okay, we are not compelled to do what we do. That part is intuitive. Mm-hmm. The free will skeptic will disagree, but the compatibilist is totally with the libertarian here. We agree with you, right? But then when they start positing the libertarian, like we can do A over B, I have metaphysical access to do that, the power of contrary choice. to access that either via event causalism, non-causalism, or even worse, agent causalism. I'm not going to put my stake in whether those, but what we say is that intuitive? It's complicated. So to just simply say we have the sense of libertarian freedom in everyday life, I'm going to press back and like, in what sense is that? And specifically, what sense is that the compatibilists cannot already agree to? It's going to be very difficult, I think, for the libertarian to make that claim. So I think that answers it, but I guess we'll see.
Right on. Josh?
It looked like Dale was going to ask something right there.
I was, but then he answered it. Although cool. I don't. So I was just, my jaw was on the floor when he said that God is not determined. So I was like, oh my goodness. I was about to say, well, then how does his free will work? And why wouldn't that be applicable to human beings? So, the randomness objection, all these objections don't matter. But then he's kind of he made this look, indeterminate doesn't necessarily mean it's all the 5 conditions that libertarian free will people would define for freedom. So sorry, you said there was 2 ways that God is indeterminate. What is that again? I missed that.
So he's indeterminate because nothing outside of him determines him to do what he does. Okay. So in that way, and then also he's, I don't know if I did say 2 ways. That's usually the way I cash it out, but maybe if you think of it. But yeah, that's why I think he's just indeterminate. He's indeterminate because nothing determines him to do what he does. Maybe we can say that his nature determines him to do what he does, but then I'm not going to say that just is determinism. I just say that he does things for reasons. Mm-hmm. That's it. And those reasons have purpose. But the libertarian says those reasons at best are triggering events or triggering influences. They still have the categorical ability, and they don't necessarily need to do A for that reason that they have in their mind. They could do, because of the categorical, they could do something else completely, the power of contrary choice. And I say, I don't think God has that kind of freedom. He must do things for reasons, and he stands by those reasons, and those reasons do generate a purposeful event. But at the same time, it is indeterminate. So, and incompatible with something causing him to do what he does. So it's complicated, but are we ought to use God's freedom as a picture of our freedom? I think so, but how we cash that out is different. Are we going to cash it out with regards to alternatives? I don't think that's the case. Just because God is indeterminate, we have strong alternatives or morally significant freedom to be able to choose evil or good. God doesn't have that. So is that supposed to be a model of our freedom? Clearly not. So, I mean, we're trying to, I guess, gain towards that, and we need that to build our moral character if libertarianism is true. That's correct, but God doesn't. But still, does it need to be a model of our freedom? No. So then we could press the Sourcehood claim, is God's freedom a model of our freedom via source? And I think yes. Is he the ultimate source of his actions? Right. But then again, I'm just going to say, because humans, does that necessarily mean that humans are the ultimate source of their actions? There's always going to be asymmetry here. That's kind of the point I'm getting at. There's always asymmetry between God's freedom and ours, whether it's incompatibilist or compatibilist. So you kind of have to weigh the options and see, right, and go from there. It's complicated because we don't have much literature on God's freedom, right? The Bible doesn't tell us much, so it's really just speculative, and that's unfortunate. So
I think I agree with that God categorically is different than humans, right? And so there's never going to be that 1-for-1 similarity between what he does and what we do. And I think you answered H. Kevin's question in that he said, he asked, is God foolish? And I clarified that, like, what do you mean by that? And he said, can he make whimful choices?
No.
And depending on what he means by whimful, yeah, I agree. There's reasons for what or why God does what he does, right? And so with those reasons, and given that God, like you said, he's omniscient, and I truly do believe the Bible teaches that. And so with the alternate possibility thing, that's why I said, I'm still on one. I'm not on the fence, but I kind of lean libertarian. But then you throw in the omniscient factor. There is one sense in which, if not multiple senses, in which there's not alternate possibilities. Maybe from our perspective, right? Since we don't know the future, that maybe it seems like it or so, but there is that one sense in which if God knows what we will do, and he is infallible, which means he cannot err in that knowledge, he's omniscient, and he knows what we will do, then there's a sense in which we cannot do other than what he knows we will do, right? And so given that, I think that that's one of the reasons why I keep kind of leaning back a little bit, is because of omniscience. I don't want to go open theist. I don't think the Bible teaches open theism whatsoever. And so with that being said, that's kind of where I'm at, Dale. So if that helps with your question you asked earlier, where I'm at, omniscience is one of those things that keeps tugging me, man. It really does.
Fair enough.
So let's see. Yeah, go ahead.
It's not going to be totally related, but I'm trying to kind of relate it to God being potentially determined and stuff like that. But I was kind of interested. I disagree with her, but Colton, do you know Susan Wolf?
Yeah.
She wrote an interesting paper, Asymmetrical Freedom, where she kind of looks at the moral value as like the main determinant. So like, what is freedom? Well, number one, it's to be determined by the true and the good. So in that case, God is morally perfect, so he would be determined. And then you have libertarian free will. So this is where the asymmetry comes in when you do stuff wrong, and that's grounded in the fact that you could literally have done otherwise. If you were if you had a choice to like go to the hospital and visit your friend, or stay home and watch TV and be lazy, the true and the good would determine you to go and visit your friend. So obviously that, for that to be different, to do otherwise and be good, you would have to ground that in a counterfactual. But you can be bad by not going, and you would still have this good and sufficient reason to go and visit your friend, even though you're doing the bad thing and watching TV. So it's that kind of gives you libertarian free will. It's kind of a mixed picture. So like, what's your take on Susan Wolf there and what she thinks about?
So asymmetrical freedom, I think it's okay. That's my layman's response to it. I think it's okay. Nelkin is a big proponent of asymmetrical freedom in her book, I think from 2011, Making Sense of Freedom and Moral Responsibility. What do I think of it? I don't necessarily side by it myself. So for instance, semi-compatibilism, I would say usually defends a symmetrical thesis. And that's namely because I think, if I remember correctly, Fisher and Revisa just argue in their book, Responsibility and Control, they argue a symmetrical kind of a freedom just because it's easier for their theory. If I remember correctly, that's what they say. And I'm like, well, that's true, because they want a whole theory for not just actions, but consequences, omissions. That's why it's like the gold standard nowadays, because they just did so much, right? They did a lot in their theory. And I kind of side with that. Like, if I'm going to be a semi-compatibilist, I think you should be just a symmetrical person there. But can the Christian use asymmetrical freedom? It depends. I think Laura Ekstrom, in her book, in her essay, The Cost of Freedom, edited by Tempe and Speak, Free Will and Theism, what she argues is against Nelkin's view, but she does say it does have some good advantages. For instance, like God's freedom. And I think that's like really good. God's freedom is great. I think we can, if we were to use asymmetrical freedom in that way, I think that's brilliant, because God doesn't ever do anything blameworthy. So if he never does anything blameworthy, he doesn't, of course, have the alternative possibility to do blameworthy. He doesn't have morally significant action in that sense, or the liberty of contradiction. He just does what is praiseworthy. So even if we say God has asymmetrical freedom, it doesn't even matter. And it's really nice. And also allows us to see us saints in heaven. So that's a good thing to see. So it has some good advantages, but I think a really powerful drawback of it is at least with Nelkin's view, and I think Nelkin tweaks Wolf's view a bit, is that God could just create everyone with the ability to just do the good all the time then, if that freedom is indeed applicable. I don't think generally God can determine all creatures to do good all the time, but not because of, Laura Ekstrom's objection to it. It's just that I just don't think he can for whatever reason. But going back to Ekstrom, I think that's plausible. And so that's one reason, or I guess many reasons, why I don't find asymmetrical freedom right now convincing, but I'm not opposed to it. I think that's a great point. When I saw that question in the messenger, I was like, that's a great question, honestly.
Awesome. So I did my goal for today. I'm like Costanza. He has one joke. I've got one good question.
I was like thinking about it all week. I'm like, wow, that's a really good question. But yeah, that's my, I guess, 2 cents on it.
Awesome. Thanks a lot.
Good job, Dale. Good job. We do have a question from Turton fan. He's in the chat, and he asked this: would you agree that in the quote flicker of freedom, Frankfurt examples, there is still no categorical access to doing otherwise than the final object of choosing/doing?
If we take his parenthetical out just slightly, and just focus on the first conditional, I would disagree there. I still think that the categorical access to do otherwise, or to will otherwise. So to do otherwise, we can posit stronger Frankfurt-style examples like stumps, and that just pushes the mechanism in the mental substrate, and then they can just will otherwise or not will otherwise. So in Stump's example, Jones could only will to do Republican, right? So he couldn't will to do Democrat. So he doesn't have the liberty of contradiction. And if libertarian freedom just requires the liberty of contradiction, well, then it's done, right? We just defeated it. But libertarians are more sly than that. And so they're going to want to hold, at least with free will, not just free action. So they're going to say, we have free will, the ability to will other options. And Tempe says, yes, for sure. We do have the ability to will other options. That is, in Jones and Stump's example, Jones could will Republican this way, or that way, or that way, or that way. Yes, you're right, Stump. He can't will Democrat, but he can will Republican in multiple different ways. And that still seems like libertarian freedom. It's weak, right? It's a weak alternative, correct. It's a liberty of contrariety, yes, but it's still weak and it's still categorical. So
it's an alternative nonetheless.
Right, it's still an alternative. And so I side with Tempe here. And I just say, right, if that's the case, Frankfurt-style examples fail for that exact reason. I'm not exactly sure what he means then the final object of choosing and doing. So maybe some clarification would be there before I say anything, but that's how I would answer it.
Right on, right on. Josh, do you got anything before we get to, I know we're at the 2-hour mark, and I do want to get to this because I think that, this last question, it'll bring everything kind of full circle for me anyway, but I want to give our audience a chance to ask, a couple more questions. And then Josh, if you've got anything while we're waiting for any more questions from the audience, and then before I get to my question, we can go that route. And then Dale, if you want to jump in after Josh, and then I will jump in after you if we don't have any more audience questions. So Josh, you got anything else to say, brother?
Honestly, I can say mentally I'm kind of running out of bandwidth here because I've been up for quite a while, and I find myself drifting in the conversation, and I don't want to be an interruption. But I feel like it would be cool if before the end of the conversation we could get to Tim's last syllogism in the episode where he was talking to Chris and talk about the justification for doubting beliefs if determinism is true. And the fact that intuition, premise, conclusion, disagreement, all of those things would be equally determined. And I'm not sure if there is an answer for that necessarily as it's staged. But I would be disappointed, I think, if we didn't get to that question, because that was one of the parts of the video that I know a lot of people wish had a little bit more expanded on it.
No, that's fine. If go ahead.
So Colton, in terms of the let's say we grant determinism to be true, right?
Right.
Is there something that you can use as justification for trusting one belief over another, with the knowledge that even the assessment of your truth and falsehood of your beliefs is equally determined, and it kind of feels like an impossible loop to escape? Do you see where the question lives?
Sort of. So
It's
do I
hard to
have
put it into the form of a question because he
rational
gave it as a
justification?
syllogism.
Go ahead.
No, I was saying it's kind of difficult for me to put it in the form of a question because of the way he states it as a syllogism. But it's basically, how do you assess the truth and falsehood of a claim if what you believe, what you intuit, and what you conclude are all equally determined?
Yeah. So I think any epistemologist view would work here. So I think this is where Stratton actually promotes his glaring question begging personally to me. It's his argument, it's his burden. He can't have an enthymeme, just like what Vela was talking about, a hidden premise in there.
Mm-hmm.
He needs to argue for it. Now he's going to say that, oh, I'm not question begging, blah, blah, but he is, because he's assuming that determinism necessarily rules out different kinds of epistemic justification. I'll give two, and I'll show that it's actually not ruled out by determinism. Okay. So the first one is just classical evidentialism. So direct acquaintance from Depeau or I think Feldman or even McGrew's. So you can take this epistemology of internalism. Can I have rational justification for me believing a doubt, or for me believing a true belief over a false belief? And the answer is yes. Why? Because all that's required underneath that view is that I have internal awareness of the reasons for why I believe what I believe, and if I have direct acquaintance of it. Now I'm slimming it down hardcore, yes, but I do talk about it in volume 2 of my reply to Stratton underneath the epistemology section. And if that's all that's required, what's necessarily against being determined for that reason? Like where's indeterminism come to play? Because what his claim is that indeterminism, I must be indeterminate when I rationally deliberate and be justified for it. But there's nothing in that necessary conditions for epistemology that claim anything on indeterminacy or determinacy. There's no metaphysical implications for it, especially if something like guidance control is true, where there is a subjectivist condition, like owning the mechanism, and also an objectivist condition, moderate reasons responsive. If I am moderately reasons responsive, I regularly receive reasons, I'm weakly reactive to those reasons in an understandable, sane way, then that means I can objectively look at evidence. I'm internally aware of those reasons. I'm directly acquainted with that evidence, and therefore my actions, weakly reactive to that evidence, therefore believe it. Nothing in there entails indeterminism. And yet Stratton wants to say that entails indeterminism, but where's the argument for that? Oh, because everything's determined? Right. But that's only a good retort if you first believe determinism necessarily rules out rational justification. Mm-hmm. Just circular. So I can claim internalism in that sense. Internalism, a great theory of epistemology, still be just as aware. And an easy way of saying this is determined awareness of my reasons for belief X is still good reason to believe X, even if it's indeterminate. Indeterminate awareness and determined awareness still get you to belief X, that I am aware of the belief. So it doesn't matter if it's indeterminate or determined. The epistemology debate literally has nothing to say on the metaphysical debate of freedom in this regard. That's one. And then number two, I can just say, okay, phenomenal conservatism. Phenomenal conservatism says if I have a belief or if I have a seeming that P, then I am justified non-inferentially that P is true. But if I'm determined to have a seeming that P, then I am rationally justified that belief P is true. So it doesn't matter if my belief or my seeming or my intuition that P is determined or not. Again, because it has nothing to do with the metaphysics of freedom here. It has everything to do just with epistemology. And so he's trying to wed the two, epistemology and metaphysics, and that's fine. But then he's just assuming that determinism necessarily rules out seemings and whatever. And actually, and then I'll be done. He says this a lot in like footnotes and everything. Well, if God causally determines all the person's intuitions and evaluations and everything, then he couldn't do otherwise, or he couldn't intuit otherwise. Right. But that just is saying that determinism rules out the regulative control or categorical ability. But it says nothing about my being rationally justified in that belief. So, right, who cares if God determines my intuitions? As long as I meet the conditions necessary for rational epistemic justification, either in classical evidentialism or phenomenal conservatism, which I contend I meet both of them, I have two views that show I can be rationally justified, even if everything's determined.
That's exactly where I was going to go. So with I'm so glad you went there, Colton, because this is the sticking point kind of for me anyway, and where I have the disconnect. But I think you just cleared that up. So in 9, let me just quote you real quick and then read the question. And then I think I know your answer already. It's because you have these conditions, and that in and of itself is what makes you justified in your beliefs, right? And so the quote is at the 145 mark, or at the 1 hour and 45 minute mark in the review that you did with Tyler. You say this: I can be determined and still have awareness of my beliefs because God can determine me to have awareness that my belief is either true or false. And when evidence comes my way, because God has determined my faculties to take hold of that evidence via moderate reason's responsiveness and owning my own mechanism there, because God has determined me to be weakly reactive to those reasons and strongly receptive to those reasons, I can change my view based on the evidence. And then the question that I would have is, but is there still a problem because God determines whether you change your mind or not, right? And so, but I think backing up, and please clarify any of this that's wrong, is that since you can, in the present, in that present moment, before you change your mind, after you change your mind, whatever, you are still rationally justified because you meet the prior two conditions that you just described, 5 seconds ago. So is that fair to say, or would you word it differently than that?
No, yeah, I think that's right. I meet the necessary conditions for epistemology to be rationally justified and to have epistemic justification, to say I have knowledge, and that now the rational deliberation is a close claim to the knowledge claim, but and we can talk about that later if we want to, if we have time. But yeah, for just knowledge, for inferencing or non-inferential justification, I meet those conditions for epistemology, and that is regardless of whether or not I'm determined. And so indeterminate awareness is the exact same thing as determined awareness with regards to epistemology, as far as I can tell, because nothing in those conditions necessitate determinism to be false. All they do is they say, if you meet these conditions, you can have knowledge. And I say, okay, then show me what determinism rules out about those conditions. And I haven't seen anything about it. So yeah, I think to me, it's even more intuitive than the libertarian claim, or at least someone pressing the free thinking argument. I don't know if you guys press it, but at least if someone's going to press the free thinking argument here, my view is actually more intuitive, because if I have evidence, my reasons are conditioned upon the evidence. Whereas if you have a libertarian defending the free thinking argument, they're going to say something like, well, I have evidence, but I have the categorical ability to actually decide regardless of the evidence. And that doesn't seem like rationality to me. That doesn't seem like he's epistemically justified to believe what he believes if it's irregardless of the evidence. We want epistemic justification attached to evidence, objective evidence. And I think that the determinist can have that because God has given him a God-given mechanism, moderate reasoned responsiveness, and this sensus divinitatis where he owns his mechanism such that If the evidence were different, then his beliefs would be different.
Right.
And he would actually go towards the objective evidence and believe that if it were presented to him.
Mhm.
Now, he can't categorically do otherwise in the exact same circumstance, right? But evidence is a historical thing. If I'm given evidence at time 1, I believe let's just say I'm given evidence for P1 at time 1,
Mhm.
then I'm going to believe in P1 because I think the objective evidence shows it.
Sure.
That can still be determined. But let's just say at time 5, T5, I'm given new evidence that I didn't necessarily have at T1, but now I'm given new evidence E2
Mhm.
for belief 2 or P2, whatever.
Yeah.
Then that means I'm more than likely going to change my evidence. Like right now, you guys, Tyler, you're like, oh, this is making sense. I'm changing my views about how I previously thought. And
Mhm.
now I'm taking this new information in, these new arguments in, this new evidence,
Mhm.
philosophical evidence, and I'm adjusting my thoughts accordingly. It's dispositional, but nothing about the dispositional environments of where we hear evidence and how we receive evidence or how we react to evidence necessarily rules out determinism.
Right.
And so this idea of, oh, determinism is just bad because it rules out epistemic justification is something that I have yet to see proved. And that's a really, really big issue for me. And so that's why I respond the way I do.
Gotcha. That makes all the sense in the world, brother. I appreciate that. I do want to address real quick Jamie's comment. So she said this: if you give me permission, I will plug your channel on my live stream. Good stuff, Jamie. Plug away, okay? I will take free advertisement any day of the week. All right. So every show, every live stream episode that you do, if you want to mention Faith Unaltered, by all means, feel free.
And CSG.
Say that again, brother. You cut out.
I said, and mention CSG.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, the Complete Sinner's Guide. So for those who don't know, that was the first podcast that I'd started. Probably what has it been now, Josh? Three years ago, I think.
Just shy of 4 years, I believe.
4 years. Gee, man. Okay.
Yep.
So and then David and I collabed together. So he had Pora, proselytize or apostatize, and I think he had started that with a gentleman, and then David Paulman actually came in and co-hosted that for a while. And then he did it by himself for a little bit with Travis Worth, Caleb Jackson, and those guys. And then I said, brother, we got 2 podcasts. We're trying to achieve the same goal. I said, let's collab it, man, and make this, community even bigger than what we already have, individualized. And so we did that. I think it's been the first of the year that we had started that. We're up to over 800 subscribers now. We're almost at the 1,000 mark. So if our listeners would definitely give us a thumbs up if you like the content, and definitely consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us out. It gets our content out there. The more y'all share it, we are, like I try to mention in all the episodes, that we are completely dependent on God and you guys to get us out there. We don't invest hardly any money into this for advertisement, because let's just face it, advertising space is expensive. And so we completely rely on our guests, on our listeners, to get our name out there. And we really do appreciate it whenever y'all do that. So keep that in mind. And we love you all. I want to help you get to 1,000. Please do. And even beyond that, the goals of our channel is to, number one, preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. I mean, I think that is it is the most important thing, especially in the world that we're living in now. We can all come together, and I think we've done a good job tonight, guys.
I agree.
Taking people that disagree, right? Putting them together in the same room or on the same platform, and just sitting down and being able to have a good conversation, one that puts forth, I don't know why don't know this word, whatever, but one that furthers the conversation and clarifies things. I think that's what so many people miss, and Colton, I'm sure you'll agree with me, on pages like Facebook and even YouTube comments. First of all, those are not a good place to have theological conversations, but if you do, try to not talk past each other. I see so much of that, just assuming, and all of it would be cleared up. Most of it would be cleared up if we would just stop take a second and not only try to understand where the other person is coming from instead of trying to prove them wrong, but just ask simple clarifying questions, like kind of like we've been doing tonight. And I think the conversation gets a lot more further in that sense. I don't know if that's a good way to word it, but it furthers the conversation in that sense. And it also eliminates this just ungodly, and coming from Christians, this ungodly attitude that I see so much, and claiming it all in the name of Christ. It's sickening, to be honest with you guys. But like I said, I think we've done a good job tonight. And Colton, I love you, brother. Thank you so much for clearing all of these things up. We'll go once more around the table, and if anybody's got anything else, I don't think we have any more audience questions.
I don't think so.
But
I went through it. I haven't seen any more
okay.
New ones. Some of them are kind of like rephrasing of other questions.
Right.
I don't want to get caught up in a cycle. So I think
right, exactly.
At the end of it.
Exactly. So, Dale, we'll start with you on this one. If you got any kind of closing remarks, and then Josh, and then I'll close this out.
Okay, so these are closing remarks, not further questions type deal.
Well, no, feel free to ask more questions if you got them, brother.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I'll combine it. So in terms of closing comments, thank you very much for letting me come on the show, and I was grateful to David Russell for giving me the invitation to probe Colton and Vela.
Yeah, Tyler Vela.
Sorry, I'm horrible. These guys are smart individuals. It was an honor to be able to kind of learn their perspective, whether I disagree with them or not, kind of thing, and consider their answers. I also really enjoyed the Chris Date and Tim Stratton debate. I think both sides did well, and I was really impressed and happy because it was actually a couple of years ago that I had Chris Date on my show, Real Seekers, and we first kind of discussed these 5 conditions for freedom. And it was new to him at that time. And then to see him on a debate kind of thing, and I was learning new things from him on that debate. So the student became the teacher on that front. So I really enjoyed these 2 shows. And I guess if you want to find me, I'm at realseekerministries.wordpress.com or just Real Seekers on YouTube. In terms of a last question for Colton, so something I'm really interested in when I took a philosophy of mind class was the issue of acrasia, or weakness of the will.
Yeah.
And I know that typically compatibilists can't really allow for acrasia, but you mentioned on your model that there is weakness of the will. So I wanted to figure out how that works on your system.
Yeah, so I would have to, without getting in the weeds, but I do know Fisher and Revisa have articulated their specific model of guidance control to allow for it. I apologize, I can't necessarily recall their thoughts specifically on the weakness of the will and how they get around it. All I can do is just simply continue telling the conditions of moderate reasoned responsiveness and mechanism ownership. I do think, though, it does have to do with moderate reasoned responsiveness. Like if someone is weak-willed, they do make a distinction, and I will say this, they do make a distinction between weak reasoned responsiveness and strong reasoned responsiveness. And basically they think that weakness of the weak reasoned responsiveness is too weak. And they, if I remember correctly, now that it's coming back to me, they make the strong reasoned responsiveness is good. And that's exactly what Fisher had before in like 1994, before he teamed up with Mark Revisa to publish the book in 1998. And that was one of the critiques that a lot of people gave to him, that it doesn't allow for weakness of the will. It's now coming back to me now that you mentioned it. And so that's where they get the moderate part, the moderate reasoned responsiveness, to allow for some sense of weakness of the will. And so, yeah, weakly reactive to reasons to allow for the weakness of will. The strong receptiveness to reasons, and then in a sane, stable, grounded in reality pattern, that allows for us to, yes, some sense, I want the chocolate cake, but I don't. Should I not? I'm going to go for the chocolate cake, and I'm kind of weak-willed in that sense. But is it still reasoned responsive? Yes, it's still reasoned responsive. It still meets their conditions. I still was receptive to many, many reasons to do otherwise, and yet I weakly reacted to this one reason that I probably shouldn't have. But is it totally against my character? Is it grounded in a sane, stable way? Yeah, I think so. We have temptations like that in our own dispositional environments. So if I remember correctly, that's briefly how they account for weakness of the will in their theory.
Awesome.
Do you have
awesome.
do you have the resource for that?
Do I have the what? Sorry.
I was going to ask if you could provide the resource, like what book or
Right.
where you got that from. So if anybody wants to look that up.
Right. So it's Responsibility and Control by John Martin Fisher and Mark Revisa, and it was published in 1998. So I think it's on Amazon for like $30-some. Basically, any one of Fisher's works, John Martin Fisher. There's also The Metaphysics of Free Will, which is a little bit more expensive. That's in 1994. It's his earlier version of guidance control. But any one of his works, honestly, are going to probably argue for guidance control. He's like the number one person for guidance control. So that, and then also to get a reformed perspective on it, how those two, this naturalistic theory, the secular theory of compatibilism that Fisher argues for, is compatible with Reformed theology. Michael Patrick Preciado, who was published, I think, in 2019. That book is called A Reformed View of Freedom, the Compatibility Between Guidance Control and Reformed Theology. Brilliant book. In fact, I actually referenced his book many times in my volume 2, because he just takes their work, John Martin Fisher's and Mark Revisa's work, and just summarizes it nicely. I mean, even if you don't care about how it's compatible with Reformed theology, those first 2 chapters in that book, A Reformed View of Freedom, just summarizes it so nicely and so well. To me, it's just a gold mine of just, I keep coming back to it just for quickies. Like what do they think about this again? And then I go to his book instead of their actual book, but it's really good.
And who'd you say wrote that? Reformed View of Freedom?
Michael Patrick Preciado. He just went on an interview discussing the book on the Gospel Truth podcast. So.
Nice.
Okay.
Nice.
Cool.
One thing, Joshua, if you're interested in books from a libertarian perspective, on the issue of crazy, one thing that was really good for me is a book by Tamar Shapiro called Feeling Like It, A Theory of Inclination and Will. I kind of took some of her ideas on Acrasia and Christianized it and stuff. But her ideas are on the burden of freedom are pretty interesting. Cool. The other thing for Ringo Cat, yes, I'm a Canadian. Yes, I drink milk from a bag. I like noodles and your cartons of milk. I don't know. Russell is,
bro, I saw that picture. I saw that picture, Dale, of milk in a bag, and it blew my mind. I was like, that's like boxed wine, bro. It don't make sense.
We got, because there's 3 little bags in that one bag of milk, right? So Canadians are weird. I don't know.
You are forgiven.
Oh man, I'm sorry, guys. I can't get over the bag milk. Oh man, that's funny. That's funny. Okay. All right. Seriousness. All right. Josh, is there anything else that you'd like to add in closing? Ringo says milk in a bag. I'm sorry. That's
just
funny.
Look it up, bro. Look it up. Milk in a bag.
You got to show the picture, Tyler, on while Joshua does his thing.
Yeah. Okay. Let me upload
but,
it real quick. Josh, go ahead.
I would say in closing, I feel like this was a success. I feel like God answered my prayer, that everyone here was very charitable and very careful with their words. There wasn't any animosity. I don't feel as though I've been, insulted or mischaracterized or patronized or anything like that. I feel like you guys took the questions with a great level of seriousness. And Colton, this is my first time interacting with you. It's very nice meeting you, and I was genuinely impressed. I have to say you look a bit like a young Brendan Fraser, which is pretty cool. And I also have to say that I was let's say pleasantly surprised by interacting with Vela in that way. That was really cool. A lot of our interactions in the comment thread don't go quite that way, so I was definitely pleased by this interaction. Dale, you impressed the heck out of me too. Not gonna lie, you're a very clever chap, and you have a really easy to read face. I like it, and I feel like I can say really comfortably that I am very happy with how this went, and I hope that a lot of people listen to it, and I hope that the Tim Strattons and the Leighton Flowers and these guys grab hold of this and really take careful assessment of what's been said here, so that we can make better responses and stop talking past each other, like you were saying. I feel like this was really well laid out, and that we reached a level of clarity that perhaps I haven't seen in other places, or maybe even not seen before at all. And so I am just super pleased to be participating in it, super pleased with how this went. And thank you guys for joining in for real, because this was like a real pleasure. And I feel like I'm going to have to listen to this 3-4 times and really chew on it.
I agree, Josh. I agree 100%. And yeah, there's 2 Tyler Fowlers up right now, but it's because I'm uploading this
original
picture
recipe and extra crispy, right?
That's right. That's right. That's right. And just to reiterate what Josh said, you know, I love, this is part of what we do, or this is how we try on Faith Unaltered to make conversations happen, right? And that's in a respectful way, because like I was saying earlier, guys, we don't get this a lot on social media platforms, and it's always refreshing to me whether I do one podcast episode on Fridays or multiple like Dale has done today. It's always refreshing to, at the end of each and every podcast, to hear Josh and just to think, you know, that this was a success in the sense that there is no arguing, there is no fighting. We can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that people who disagree can come together and still respect one another. And I think that was, I think it was golden tonight how we did that. And so I'm very, very much stoked about that. And just to kind of, I've got a lot to think about. So just to kind of reiterate what I was saying earlier about leaning lib and seeking truth. That's just something that I want to just to say to everyone listening. You know, it's always good in a couple senses, really, to be open about things, because if we're not seeking those things, then what are we really doing with what God has given us, right? We should always, I think it's a good thing that we always question things. You know what I mean? Even if we think we've arrived at the truth of those things, because there's always going to be somebody that comes and presses us on things that we haven't thought about, you know? And so it's always a good, even if it's just a mental exercise, to really think through what we believe. Because at the end of the day, whenever somebody comes and asks us, and this gets practical, and 1 Peter 3:15 comes into play, you know, be ready, sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart, and be ready to give a reason for the hope that is within you. You know, if we fail to do that on any front, think about what that does, you know, especially in this day and age where Christianity on all fronts is being attacked in multiple different ways. And so I want to recommend to everybody listening, to all of our guests and to all of our listeners, you know, keep thinking through these things, keep striving for truth. And I think that everything will turn out and be just hunky dory. And so again, I want to thank Colton and Tyler for coming on with us and to discuss these concepts. I think that this is going to be, it has been, and I think it's going to continue to be a big debate and discussion topic within Christianity, because there's so much of the unknown that is yet to be explored in this topic. And I think, honestly, guys, that, and y'all can agree, disagree with this, but I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg whenever it comes to diving into how all of these things work, right? How God's sovereignty is compatible with our freedom. And so I think it's a question on a lot of people's minds. I think with the Date and the Stratton discussion, and now this discussion, we've got a lot of people thinking, and not only that, but Colton, the discussion that you had with Tyler on that on the Freed Thinker podcast, also Turretson fan and Dan Chappa did a review of that discussion. And so not only that discussion, but I think all these discussions have got people talking, and more importantly, thinking about why it is they believe what they do. And I will grant that a success any day of the week. And so again, Colton, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure, brother. It's been an honor. I've enjoyed getting to know you and talking through these things. You've messed up though, because now I'm going to pick your brain on a bunch of stuff. And so also, if you could send me those resources, that would be fantastic. And I will put them in the description. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say thank you so much. It's been an honor to be on here. And so appreciate it. I wouldn't mind coming back at all. This has been great. So
Awesome.
Just hit me up anytime. I'm generally like always busy. You can ask my wife, Vela, but I'll try to always make time to come in and talk about truth. So, and so much so, I don't know if you guys knew this, but I actually have it tattooed on my arm. So it's Latin for like kind of, so Fides Veritas, what is truth?
Nice.
And Roman numerals are John 14:6. So it's I care about it too. That's why I got it. That's why I'm a philosophy teacher. That's why I have a degree in theology, and why I care about the church so much. And I do, as well as you guys, I do want some cordial conversations. And so I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
You're more than welcome anytime, brother. And so we'll definitely make that happen. But guys, it's been fun. It's been an absolute blast, as David always says, and as it is true. We do have a lot of episodes coming in November. So again, I want to reiterate, if you have not subscribed to the channel, please consider doing that. Smash that big red subscribe button, and then click the notification bell off to the right hand side of that. All will pop up, ALL. And if you click that, then you will be notified every single time we go live and have discussions like these. Just a couple things. So we've got Parker Setcase coming on from Parker's Pensée to talk about the author analogy on November the 22nd. And that's going to be at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. We've also got Travis Worth and Than Christophus coming on to discuss the reality, basically, what best describes the world that we live in now. Atheism, Christianity, something else entirely. We're going to bring Than and Travis on to discuss that. We've also got our mini series answering Jewish objections to Jesus in the works. I think we've got Dr. Egal German who's going to come on and help us out with that. And also, we're taking recommendations. So if you know of anybody that is on that topic, we've reached out to Dr. Michael Brown. We've reached out to a couple different people actually on this topic. But if y'all have any recommendations, please let us know. We will reach out to those people. And because I think, listening to the debate that Rob Solberg had with Rabbi Tovia Singer, that's an interesting conversation in and of itself. And I think that's another one, kind of like the compatibilism and determinism and compatibilist discussion. It's got people talking and thinking as well. And what better topic, I think, to reach out to our Jewish friends and even family and relatives, those that deny Christ, those that deny their Messiah, to give them reasons and answers for why they should accept Christ as their Messiah. And so we're going to be talking about things like the resurrection. We've got an interview. Oh, Dell, I'm gonna go ahead. I released it kind of last night, but Dell and David and myself, we're trying to get a discussion with Gary Habermas on his one of his books that he will be releasing.
Okay, so he sent me an email afterward. It's not going to be He was saying January 2024 is when Volume 1 will be.
Take it.
Yeah. Definitely he'll be on your show.
Fuck it.
I'll force him. I'll tell him.
Well, don't force him. Let him choose of his own free will, and
he will determine it for himself.
Yeah.
But so I'm definitely excited to collab with Dale on that episode. Do you know when that is going to take place? Are we talking 2024 or?
He's saying the big guy, as he calls it, or Volume 1 will be out. He's thinking January of 2024, January 24th, around there.
But are we trying to get him on before that or during that time?
So no, yeah, during that time.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Book it, dude. Look, if somebody tells me, look, I'm not available for another 4 years, I said, I'll take your first opening availability. So you just let me know and we'll make that happen. So that's something to be on the lookout for. We will update whenever Dale gets updates on that. I will let you guys know if you're interested in that discussion. And again, guys, it's been a blast. I thank you all so much for your input, for your pushback, and for your your intellect on this subject. I think it's important to get people on that know what they're talking about. And Colton, I'm very surprised. You're awesome, bro, and I really appreciate you helping me out through this as well as our listeners. And so with that, guys, we will sign off. And again, we will see you next time on Faith Unaltered. Good night, God bless, and stay like Christ.